I want to introduce, my great joy to introduce Andrew Boyd. Many of you know him, one of our choir directors, parishioners, and a seminary graduate, among other things. Lots of interesting things in his life. I'm told it's not on the sheet, but he likes fly fishing. Yeah. I happen to know Father Thomas Hopko loved fly fishing too. Anyway. Okay, try it again. You got to practically repeat this thing, and I'll turn it up a little bit more over there so they can hear you. And tonight's topic is Lazarus Saturday, what it is, and what are we doing, a liturgical view. And I can't think of a better way to enter into Lazarus Saturday and Palm Sunday than that. So Andrew, take it away.
It's kind of always nice to get an applause before you say anything at all. Father asked me to give one of the Lenten talks, and I was thinking over, what can I possibly tell folks about, and what kind of edifying thing could I do? And then I remembered that kind of my capstone paper at seminary was on Lazarus Saturday, so I thought maybe I could mine that for a little bit of material. Before we dive in, just some kind of broad definitions. I'll use the word liturgy a lot. What I mean by that is all of the ritualistic things we do inside the church building and sometimes outside the church building when we go around it. Broadly, not just the divine liturgy, which is one of the things that makes up liturgy more broadly, but all the kinds of services that we do in church. There's three principal ways academically we study the liturgy. The first is a discipline called liturgics, and that's kind of probably the most boring of the three. That's simply the study of the rules. What time do I swing the censer? What color vestments do I wear? What tone should we be singing in? At what time should what thing happen? Very much the nuts and bolts of the services. So that's liturgics, and that's one way we can study liturgy. The second way academically people look at the liturgy is through a lens we call liturgiology. And liturgiology is the history of our services and of our worship. So that's kind of using primary sources, using manuscripts, using archaeological records, using even church buildings and architecture to draw out a kind of historical record of how the things we do in church developed. For most of us here as Orthodox Christians in America, now in this year, our liturgiological journey goes back to the city of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. Broadly speaking, academics would call us the Byzantine liturgical tradition, even though we may have come to Orthodoxy through Slavic grandparents or an Episcopalian upbringing or reading on the internet or anything like that. But broadly speaking, historically, the things we do in church originated mostly through the lens and context of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire. So that's the second way. The final way we study liturgy is something called liturgical theology. And if anyone is familiar with the works of Father Alexander Schmemann, he basically made this up. This is his contribution to our life as Christians. He said, and he wrote in his seminal book, Introduction to Liturgical Theology, very wisely named, that the liturgy informs us theologically, meaning that as Christians, we can take knowledge from the services and the rituals that we participate in, not just in and of themselves and what we do and what we're doing and where it came from, but to tell us about what we believe in God and what we believe about God and his relationship to us as human beings. We're going to try doing all three tonight, and I hope you'll kind of bear with me because I plan to make this a bit participatory. Now, the last time I did something like this was with a teen group, and I made them sing it. So, you're getting off easy. Nobody has to sing nothing.
We can do it.
But there are sheets floating around with some liturgical texts on them. One of the best ways, I think, to study liturgy, and maybe it's kind of even stupid to say it, is simply to look at the text of what we're doing. We don't actually always do this. So why Lazarus Saturday? Lazarus Saturday has always been attractive to me as a kind of topic of study and interest because it's so unique to our Byzantine liturgical tradition, our received tradition. I think you would be hard-pressed to find anything like it in any other Christian tradition, excepting maybe some of the so-called Oriental churches like the Copts and the Armenians who are really closely ingrained into kind of the way we do liturgy too. It's really, really unique. And then within our tradition, it's also really unique, and we'll get into why that is. But what propelled me to write this paper when I was in seminary was because I got in an argument with a priest while I was a choir director about what to do on Lazarus Saturday. And if we have time, we can cover that story, but I'll save that for the end. There's kind of a tradition within liturgical theology and liturgical studies that older is better, and older often means more accurate. I don't know that that's always true, but in any case, we're going to start with the absolute oldest extant, meaning we still have it, historical record of Lazarus Saturday. Anytime you're going back in time in liturgy, you usually kind of stop with this one person. She's remarkable. Her name is Egeria. She's a nun from Spain. She's remarkable in that she traveled to Jerusalem on or about the year 360 or 380 AD, so 4th century, really early in the life of the church. And she wrote down everything she saw. So a woman who was educated, who could write, and then who was particularly observant about what they were doing liturgically. Like what were the Christians actually doing in Jerusalem at this time? So we're going to start with her. I have a quote from her, but I'm going to set it up a little bit. She talks about going to Bethany, to what they called the Lazarium, Latin for basically the Lazarus place. There was a church built over the tomb of Lazarus. It's still there. All the Christians in the city gathered there on Lazarus Saturday, the day before Palm Sunday. So that's the Saturday before Holy Saturday. So that's something we still do, right? That date is still fixed. They had liturgy. They had the Divine Liturgy and Communion, Eucharist service. Not quite as developed yet as the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom that we do today, but you would see a lot of similarities. And then, afterwards, she reports the following, and it's quote number 1 on your sheet. I'm going to read this one. Then, at the dismissal, a presbyter, which means priest, announces Easter. He mounts a platform and reads the gospel passage, which begins, quote, when Jesus came to Bethany 6 days before the Passover. After this reading, with its announcement of Easter, comes the dismissal. They do it on this day because the gospel describes what took place in Bethany 6 days before the Passover, and it is 6 days from this Saturday to the Thursday night on which the Lord was arrested after the supper. Think about it for a minute. Read it again if you have to, because I'm going to come and ask you to give any kind of thought or reaction to this passage, probably from around the year 380, about how Lazarus Saturday was kept and celebrated by early Christians. There's no wrong answers. Maybe there's a wrong answer, but I think there'd be very few wrong answers. But just a thought on that for a minute. Read it again for a minute if you have it in front of you, and think about something you would want to share with all of us about your reaction. And I'm going to go to Father first because...
No, that's cheating. That's cheating. Go to Father first.
Well, it shows obviously that even at this early century, there was the developed progression in terms of the celebration, the end of Great Lent, and the bridge Lazarus Saturday, Palm Sunday, to Holy Week. And then, of course, the Passion of Christ leading up to the resurrection. So this, what happens to Lazarus, as it said in one of the hymns tonight from Lazarus Saturday.
Oh, don't give away the punchline.
Oh, sorry.
That's good. I think I would challenge you a little bit. There was no mention of Lent in there.
You're right.
But there is a kind of sense that something bridging is going on here and that this day is being used to kind of point elsewhere. Abby, that's cheating too. Go ahead.
Well, I think the thing that surprised me the most were the words "announces Easter."
Yeah, it's arresting. You don't expect it there.
Right, because we don't think of Lazarus Saturday as Paschal. I mean, it's foreshadowing, but that is not at all what we think of as Pascha or Easter.
Yeah, and I would challenge the translator on this one. The word is not Easter. It's Passover in the original. Doug.
This may seem dumb, but here's a perfect example that even back then, at the end of the service, they had a dismissal.
Right, classic Orthodox thing.
Variation on
Yeah. Classic Orthodox thing. We're done praying. Let's go pray some more.
But this
Yeah. It's a very.
structure was already there.
The structure is it feels so familiar to us because we do basically the same thing, right? Maybe not on Lazarus Saturday, maybe on Palm Sunday instead, but probably one or the other. Usually there's a procession outside if the weather's permitting and you're not in Siberia, although I tend to think the Siberians would go outside anyways. So there's something very familiar to us about this in terms of the structure of what they're doing. I think announces Pascha or announces Easter is like the key phrase there. Something else jumps out at me about what they're reading. Doug, I thought you were going to pick up on that one.
Well, it shows that the Gospel of John is an accepted thing at that point in time.
Yeah, that's actually debated by a lot of current scriptural commentators. I hesitate to use the word scholar because it's clear in the historical evidence here that it's being used. Which chapter is being used is interesting to me. The reading that they read is the beginning of chapter 12. Lazarus is resurrected in chapter 11. So it's strange to me a bit that they aren't reading the account of Lazarus being raised from the dead, but that part that we read actually now on Palm Sunday during the Divine Liturgy, 6 days before the Feast of Passover, what happened? Jesus came back to Bethany. There's a meal with Lazarus and his sisters. Is it Mary or Martha washes his feet? Can't remember which one. I think it's Mary. And then Jesus kind of prophesies the entire rest of the week. He fills out, here's what's going to happen to me. I'm going to get persecuted. I'm going to die. I'm going to rise again. So again, it's that it ties into that real announcement of Pascha being the point. The scripture that they're reading is not the account of Lazarus being raised from the dead. It's of Christ prophesying about what's to come during the week. I'm going to move on, but anything else anyone else had on Agerias?
Actually, just a question. How do you calculate Saturday and then 6 days is Thursday?
Yes, the math is wrong. Which is also, you'll notice, if you listen really carefully this weekend in church, the math is wrong. So we'll hear in the hymns on 6 days before the Feast of Passover, 6 days. And it also depends on what Passover, right? Because there's a different chronology in John's Gospel than there are in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in terms of when Passover is happening during Holy Week. To a modern ear, we sometimes want historical accuracy as a kind of guiding line in some of these things in the church, where I don't think that was a concern in the early church. They're not worried about, are we replicating correctly the historical events in the timing? It's the content of what they're doing. So again, there she's trying to make a case for part of the reason why we announce Easter this day is because it's somehow 6 days before a Thursday, which it's not. Even liturgically, if you do the math starting in the evening. I would ascribe to this is Andrew Boyd's personal opinion, not the teaching of the church. the church does this thing where it knows the end of the story, and it can't help but announce it early. It's like already, but not yet, is what Father Schmemann would call it. So it's like the church can't contain the message that's coming. So that's sometimes why you get even on, you'll get it a lot in Lazarus Saturday. It's the hymnography is actually about the coming resurrection, even though we're just on the starting edge of the whole kind of narrative of Holy Week. And that's part of the reason why, we sing on Holy Friday at Matins, which is Thursday night, and again at Holy Saturday Matins, which is Friday night, and these really dark and dramatic moments, we worship your passion, show us the resurrection, because we know it's coming. Moving on to number 2, which if you are very attentive, you would recognize from church just now. This is a stikira, which is just a way of saying a hymn. And maybe just to kind of preface this a little bit, the rest of everything I'm pulling is from our quote-unquote liturgical books. Father and the choir directors don't get up on a Wednesday morning and just say, wouldn't it be nice if we sang hymn 132 tonight? Not how it works here. We have a very complicated, sometimes contradictory structure of books and astronomical calendars that inform us what we're supposed to do liturgically at every service. The book we use primarily at this time of year is called the Lenten Triodion. There might be, I'm certain there's a copy upstairs in English. So these are hymns that we are appointed to sing at Presanctified Liturgy on the final Thursday of Lent, because our liturgical day always begins at sundown. So even though it's Wednesday, it's Thursday. And number 2 stuck out to me for tonight. And I wonder if I could have a volunteer just to read it in a plain voice. No need to sing it or chant it. But I would love to take a sip of water. So. Someone's making eye contact with me or avoiding it.
I am rich in passions, I am wrapped in the false robe of hypocrisy. Lacking self-restraint, I delight in self-indulgence. I show a boundless lack of love. I see my mind cast down before the gates of repentance, starved of true goodness and sick with inattention. But make me like Lazarus, who was poor in sin, lest I receive no answer when I pray. No finger dipped in water to relieve my burning tongue, and make me dwell in Abraham's bosom in thy love for man.
Thank you. Hearing that, or maybe rereading it now quickly, anything stand out to anybody?
I love that expression, a boundless lack of love.
Yeah, that's a rough one. Yeah.
Contradiction.
Yeah, but also it's you do point to something a little curious and very typical of our hymns during Lent and at no other time in the church. They're in the first person, which I always find arresting, I guess because I'm usually singing or reading them. So then it's like you make it really personal. You're like, oh, it's me they're talking about. But it is, that's the point. Yeah. Anything else? Anything else jump out to anybody?
It's a reference, isn't it, to the rich man, the parable of Lazarus?
Oh yeah.
and
So
the rich man.
it's referencing the wrong Lazarus, maybe. There's more than one in the New Testament. Historically, they could have been the same person. I don't really know. One's a parable, so probably not. So it's a reference actually to the Lazarus of Luke's gospel, not John's. John's is the one we are all really familiar with. It's the resurrection of Lazarus story in chapter 11. We get this Luke reading, which is chapter 16, usually on a Sunday in January in a more Slavic style church, which we are. And it's that story of the rich man who ignores the beggar that's named Lazarus, dies and gets sent to hell. He's begging up, to Abraham's bosom. He sees Lazarus up there. He's begging, can't you just dip your finger in water and cool my tongue? No is the answer. And I think if you're looking at it from a purely academic standpoint, you might be almost tempted to think didn't the hymn writers know their Bible? Like, they got it wrong, right? Like, it's the wrong Lazarus. But I don't believe that. I don't think that people who write hymnography in the church, who did nothing else but listen to scripture all day, every day, who would have heard the complete Bible a couple times over every year in the context of a Byzantine monastery, got it wrong. I think they're actually trying to make a point. So any thoughts on kind of why they would, in this time of reflecting on Lazarus's death and resurrection, why are we pointing to this Luke Lazarus?
Because Lent is a time where almsgiving, and the rich man was clearly not obeying that particular.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong theory. There's actually manuscript evidence from the Armenians going back kind of almost pre-Byzantine Empire that suggests this gospel reading was read on the 5th Sunday of Lent before going into Lazarus Saturday. The evidence isn't super strong that that was a universal practice, and it would be hard to find that if you looked at kind of Russian or Greek sources only. So I don't know that that's a universal truth, but I think it is a pretty compelling theory. I have one more theory on why, though. Do you remember how that gospel reading ends? Remember the rich man's begging, can't you just send somebody to tell my loved ones that this is going to happen? And how does it end? If they did not listen to Moses and the prophets?
Yeah, why would they listen to, like, because I think he even asks, can you please send Lazarus?
Yeah.
Tell my brothers.
Yep.
To warn them. And they said, well, but they have the prophets, they have the scripture, why would they not, why do you think they would listen to Lazarus instead of, when they have all the prophets?
Yeah, it's even more stark.
To someone even if they rose from the dead.
Yeah, it's really stark, right? It's not that they didn't listen. It's you have, right? You have not listened to Moses. You have not listened to the prophets. Why would they be convinced if someone were to rise from the dead? So I think that puts a pretty fine point on it. And there isn't a right answer, right? This is an interpretation we're doing together. I think both answers are very compelling and give us both something to reflect on as we kind of come to the coda of the Lenten season. Both, in terms of like taking stock of our own almsgiving and care for the poor and people around us, but also it's very haunting to me, at least, my personal opinion here. Like, what? I've seen the person raised from the dead. How many Paschas do I have under my belt at this point? 30 something? What have I been convinced of, and how have I changed my life? There's also a kind of moral sense to this hymn that is really present in a lot of our hymnography in Lent of assuming kind of the worst behaviors of the people who are singing. But being a choir director, maybe that's true.
I think something else that resonated with me was the almost mundaneness that they point out of these sins. Like it's not murder, it's not adultery, it's starved of true goodness, sick with inattention, a lack of love, I'm lacking self-restraint, I'm delighting in self-indulgence. There's something so relatably.
Oh yeah, didn't they make that so nicely universal? Like,
Yeah.
who can say that this doesn't apply to them?
Yeah.
How egalitarian and Catholic of them. Catholic in the small c sense of the word.
Okay, I'm lost. Why are we talking about this thing that we did tonight when we're having a liturgical view of Lazarus?
Oh, we'll get there. Actually, that's a great segue to number 3, because number 3 is also from tonight. Doug, do you want to read it?
Now Lazarus has been in the tomb for 2 days, seeing the dead of all ages, beholding strange sights of terror and countless multitudes, bound by the chains of hell. His sisters weep bitterly as they gaze at his tomb. But Christ is coming to bring his friend to life, to implement in this one man his plan for all. Blessed art thou, O Savior, have mercy on us.
Strong reading. So Doug, does that help you out at all? That was also from tonight. If not, I can connect a few.
You're saying this is a preview to Lazarus Saturday?
Yeah, yeah. And if you were in, I mean, so we're in a,
A teaser?
absolutely, it's a trailer. It just dropped on YouTube as soon as it gets uploaded from the parish.
He's already in the grave.
Yeah, I mean, it's even more actually striking if you look at, we're a parish church, we don't have services every day, but if you look at the texts appointed for every day this week, the narrative starts Sunday night. Lazarus is sick, Christ can't get there. Lazarus is dying, Christ can't get there. Lazarus is in the tomb already. Lazarus is starting to stink. Like it's a very strong narrative structure through the whole week. It's funny in the choir books upstairs. This week's text was labeled Week of Palms, and I just thought there thinking, there's no reference to palms. It's the Week of Lazarus. Everything's about Lazarus, and this is just one of the stichera from tonight, one of the hymns from tonight. But there were easily 4, 5, or 6 that were about him, and that's unusual in our church structure. It would really only happen kind of at a really big feast. So another place you would get this is Christmas. If we're doing the daily services like on the 22nd and the 23rd of December, you start to get like a little like previews, like Mary and Joseph are trying to get into the inn, things like that. The same thing with Theophany. You get like little narrative previews on like January 2nd and 3rd if you're doing the daily services. It's very unusual to get this level of narrative structure around a church event that's coming through the hymnography. Any thoughts as to why? Other than it's a very good story. That could be a great answer.
It's the whole resurrection story in the verse in which this says.
Yeah, that's such a great line. Do you want to read that?
But Christ is coming to bring his friend to life, to implement in this one man his plan for all.
Yeah, man, that really puts a point on it, I think. I think there's also probably an additional reason. So all of Holy Week works like this, right? It has this very strong narrative structure. And Lazarus Saturday is actually like the first part of that. Lazarus Saturday, you start hearing hymns already on the evening, on Saturday evening, going into Palm Sunday, about the crowds with the palms, the Feast of the Kingdom, all the people shouting Hosanna. Wait, these are the same crowds that are going to crucify him. Wait, the Pharisees are already plotting because they're so scared by what happened in Bethany with Lazarus in the crowds. So I think part of it too is like, it kicks off all the action. All this stuff that's going to happen over the next more than 6 days is related to Lazarus.
I'm also struck by the Christ that talked about Lazarus as Christ's friend. And that connects in my mind with one of the things that we say in that long part of the service that gets interspersed with Psalm 119 on the night of Holy Friday, where there's something about Christ having come to save his friend Adam and not seeing him there, he descended into hell to find him. I'm very touched by that phrase that you quoted in this passage, because it's almost as though, yes, it's all mankind, it's humanity in a mass, but it's also very particular, and it seems to...
It's also me, and it's also you.
Yes, it seems to bring the idea of Christ's very specific and intimate love for each of us. That's what's going on here, and we're not supposed to lose sight of that.
Yeah, you'll see in a lot of the other hymns, even from tonight, I think there was a reference in one of the other hymns about this man who caused Jesus to weep, right? Shortest line in the New Testament from John's 11th chapter is just Jesus wept in response to arriving at Lazarus' tomb. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Any other reactions to number 3?
Well, I feel like it's similar to what Terrell was saying, in that he's showing us this is what he's going to do for us. He's going to come and he's going to rescue us.
Yeah. There's like a kind of, I was thinking about how the receivers of this hymn would hear it in Byzantium. And it's not always healthy to kind of do a historical imagination, but in a place where the average life expectancy was like 38 or 39, death had a way of being a little bit more present. And I also think that's part of the reason why this narrative is so strong and so personal, is because it reflects this is the way out. You know, Christ did this thing so that we don't have the finality of physical death. There is a kind of something else to come. It's by somebody. Does that strike anybody as weird? It's by somebody. There's a byline. It's by Theodore. Not all of our hymns are by or attributed to specific people, but this hymn is attributed to Theodore, who probably is Saint Theodore the Studite, who is a monk in Constantinople, who's responsible for writing a lot of our hymns. One of the kind of more interesting things about hymns during Lent and Holy Week is these bylines are a little bit more present than they are in other parts of our hymnography. In modern times, we've kind of found it objectionable for people to sign hymnography anymore. So when we have a new saint and the hymns get written, people tend not to put their name on them anymore. I think it's probably a healthy thing. But in Byzantium, it was very common. And look up Theodore the Studite. He's a very famous saint if you don't know him. He impacted our liturgical practices probably more than anybody in the history of the church. I will also say that the only female hymnographer from the Byzantine period starts coming up a lot over the next few days in Holy Week. That's Saint Cassiani. She also has an incredible life, which I will not rehearse here, but you should visit on your own time. If you turn the page over, actually, before we get into number 4, I had one more comment on 3. Within the whole kind of narrative drama of Lazarus Saturday, Lazarus Week, Holy Week, and Pascha, from the outside it can look like very dramatic, the Orthodox way of doing it. And maybe it looks that way from the inside too, you know, different levels of solemnity, special hymns, special vestments, the Plashenitsa or Epitaphios, the tomb. It's very dramatic. And I think we should resist the temptation to look at it as simply a kind of historical reenactment, or maybe even in a worse light, a kind of medieval passion play. The drama is there not for those reasons. We're not doing historical recreation. This isn't like we're going out on a Civil War battlefield and pretending to be soldiers, nor are we pretending to be centurions at the tomb. You'll hear again and again, if you open your ears a little bit, it's now, 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 today, today, today. These things are happening. Today, he who hung the earth upon the waters is hung upon the cross. You know, it's an immediacy there by design. Metropolitan Anthony Bloom would say, or challenge us even, to use that opportunity to reflect on where that puts ourselves, where that puts me in the narrative. You know, we'll hear a lot of different things going on. Am I Peter denying Christ? Am I the myrrh-bearing women ready with faith in the cold of the night, but not sure what's going on? Am I another negative example of the myrrh-bearing women, that they were too afraid to even say anything about the resurrection? You know, am I Thomas who didn't believe until he touched something? There's so many narratives and characters for us not to get lost in a good story. There's probably even better stories out there right now on any streaming platform. But it's to force us, the narrative forces us to be self-reflective if we let it. And to think about and account for, where am I in this story and where could I be?
Sorry, I just want to share one thing. I think sometimes also it's easy for us to almost take for granted because we get to have Pascha every year. And every year it's amazing and exciting, but I had a friend come one time and it was his first time because he was not raised Orthodox, and he looked at me at the end of the service and he was like, I feel like I was at the first Easter. I feel like this is the first time I've ever really been to Easter. And it was so beautiful. And I think that was kind of the point that you were
Yeah.
also saying, like, that's why we do it. It's not theater, it's to remind us that it's real, and it happened, and it does happen.
Right, and that's a positive example. I'll give a negative one. What a tragedy it is if that means nothing changes in your life. You know, we've all been given, everyone in this room, this great gift of this liturgical tradition, and to experience Pascha in its fullness, in its presentness, in its todayness when it happens. And I hope that makes me live my life a little different. I don't know that I'm successful at it most days, but anyone up for reading number 4? I feel like this side of the room has been kind of quiet. Wayne?
We have completed the 40 days that profit our souls. Now let us beg the lover of man, enable us to see the holy week of your passion, that we may glorify your mighty work, your wonderful plan for our salvation, as we sing with one heart and voice, O Lord, glory to you.
Yeah, so this is a stichera, a hymn from the Vespers of Lazarus Saturday, which would have been served Friday evening. So this is our first kind of selection that's actually from what we're doing on Lazarus Saturday. Any thoughts, Wayne, on that as you read it?
Well, a lot of people, one thought is that a lot of people think of Lent as lasting to Pascha.
Lent is over.
And Lent is over. Lent is over, whatever, Friday night, or is it Saturday night?
Friday night,
Friday night.
when we sing this. Hard to argue with that. They're pretty clear.
So Lent is now over.
Yeah.
Now we're in a different,
Yeah.
more strict period, but it's, so that.
Yeah, that doesn't mean go out and eat pulled pork. I think it's not uncommon, but it's not always present that the liturgy is actually trying to signal to us something about time in our life and what's going on and disciplines. This one's really clear. The Lenten period is done. Something else is happening now. For most people hearing this in the context of a monastery, that would mean even stricter fasting, even more time in church. I think for most of us too, Holy Week is an elevated experience in terms of the ascetical disciplines of our faith. We're trying to live a simpler life. Most of our free time is given over to church services. And I just wanted to share this to show that the liturgy has different functions and the hymns have different functions. Sometimes they're trying to bring us into a narrative. Sometimes they're trying to make us make a connection in our heads to something else in Scripture. Or sometimes they're literally just signaling this period of time is now done. Your behavior needs to change. And pray that you can get through it. That's the other part. Yes.
Sorry. I also really liked the phrase that we may glorify your mighty work, your wonderful plan for our salvation. Christ's passion isn't just something that happened to him, that he was like a victim of. This is his work. It's active and it's intentional and it's triumphant. It's not just sort of a tragedy. Yeah,
that's such an important point. That procession we do Holy Friday evening when we sing Holy God and we bring the shroud around. Sometimes that's interpreted as a funeral procession, but instead, actually, most of the history points to that as a procession to remind us that Christ is active in the tomb and doing stuff for us, and that the Sabbath day physically might be a rest day that we're coming into, but he's down there breaking the chains and doing all the fun stuff. I would also add, too, on a more broader theological level, I think a theological point we can take away from this is, or maybe start to contemplate because it's not quite in the text, that this is the plan for salvation. This isn't a plan for salvation. It's not like Adam and Eve happened, the fall happened, and then God was like, I got to do something, send Jesus. That's not what we believe. We believe that this plan for salvation was always the plan for salvation because it's the plan that preserves human free will and ensures that God's unbounded love comes into his creation. Anything else on that one? It's a trick question. Back tables are quiet.
I just want to say that plan for salvation by raising Lazarus, Christ had been telling his disciples that he will die on essentially he will be arrested and killed. And his disciples, some of them dismiss it, others probably, I don't think anybody was really taking it seriously or terrified. By doing this, he actually points out to them, all I've been telling you and all you've been thinking about me, that
I'm the real deal.
who I am,
Yeah.
who he is. Yeah, I'm the real deal. Here is a proof. I can raise that man. So when a week later I'm crucified, you remember that. You remember who I am. So you remember my words when I told you I'm going to be killed or die for your sins. You don't despair because you saw what I did, and everything I've told you took place, and so don't lose hope. Don't get scared. And what I've told you will happen to me, you have seen with your eyes already happened to Lazarus.
Yeah.
You must believe me.
And I'm projecting that it's going to happen to you. I think within the church tradition, only Matthew of the 12 doesn't die by martyrdom. So, yeah. Yeah, thanks. Good for sharing. Anything else on number 4? Victor, you're quiet back there.
Well, like you were saying earlier, I like this Sakura because it really is like it's Vespers, closing out Lent, and we're focusing on something completely, not completely.
Yeah, it's connected, but it's like we're entering. You know that part of when you're on a plane where like the flight attendants start picking up the garbage, and you got to put your seat back up and your tray table. Like that's kind of how I feel about this Takira. There's also a lot of prayers within our Stikira for the people doing the labor of the church. So I love this line, enable us to see the Holy Week of your Passion. It's a prayer, it's an acknowledgement that all the work that goes into church life, especially at this time of year, is work. And it's a hope that we all make it through the next week and get to see everything the church has to offer to us ritualistically over the course of the next 7 or 8 days. I'm going to read number 5 because it's my favorite. It's the Kontakion for Lazarus Saturday. A Kontakion is a type of hymn, a kind of daily hymn. I chose the Kontakion because they tend to be older. I don't have the exact date on this one, but this is the hymn specifically for Lazarus Saturday. Christ, the joy, the truth, and the light of all, the life of the world and the resurrection, has appeared in his goodness to those on earth. He has become the image of our resurrection, granting divine forgiveness to all. So that's the hymn for Lazarus Saturday.
But it could be sung on Tosca, because basically it's already saying he's come back from the dead, appeared to
We know the end of the story.
appeared to those on earth. He is the image of our resurrection. That's after his resurrection.
Yeah.
So
And,
there's already,
and the Greek word there is icon,
yeah.
which I probably would have kept in if I did the translation, but I didn't. Anything else strike you as weird that on this hymn about Lazarus Saturday?
Lazarus isn't in it.
Yeah. There's no mention of Lazarus at all, or of the events in the gospel necessarily. I mean, kind of generally they're referenced because he's the resurrection, but it's very telling. There is a feast of Saint Lazarus. It's in October. It is not on the Saturday before Pascha. So there's a temptation sometimes to, it's Lazarus Saturday. Put out the icon of Saint Lazarus. No, it's nothing. It's not the feast of Saint Lazarus. It is a feast of Christ in the church's kind of schema of how they define feasts and what does that mean for what we sing and what we do. And I think this Kontakion just makes it so clear. Even the Troparion, which we probably all know, but starts by raising Lazarus from the dead before thy passion, that's the only reference to Lazarus. The rest of it's about the universal resurrection and what Christ has accomplished for us. Also, that same Troparion is carried over to Palm Sunday, so we hear it a lot that weekend. I also just think it's beautifully written. Sometimes we get bombarded with so much hymnography in our church an overabundance, a very kind of Byzantine way of looking at things in terms of you can imagine big flowing purple robes and the emperor saying, give me every hymn you could possibly bring up about Lazarus Saturday, you know, an overabundance that sometimes it's just almost like overwhelming. And I would just encourage everyone this week to stop, think, hear, and listen, read. We have wonderful access in this church to texts of the hymns, which through most of the church's life, people were largely illiterate. So it's a huge gift, and I would encourage people to kind of take the time to sit and think and find some quiet in the coming week if you can, amidst all the preparations, and hear the text. Okay. Number 6 is really short, if somebody wants to read it. Or if Wayne wants to say it in Slavonic.
I'll read it. As many as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Hallelujah.
Although you missed what we call in liturgical studies the red text, because when it's an instruction to whoever is supposed to be doing it, it's always somehow in red, even in the current like OCA books. I saw an exhibit once at the Met, and it was like priest service books from like the 1100s, and they had the red text in. I'm like, oh, that's where we got it from. So it's red when it's an instruction. It's red colored, and it's I have it here. It's in italics and bold, and then the text of what you're supposed to do follows. So this is an instruction for the Divine Liturgy of John Chrysostom on Lazarus Saturday.
Is that the first time we do John Chrysostom since Lent starts?
John Chrysostom is appointed for every Saturday, even the Saturdays during Lent, but good point. Normally during Lent on Sundays we have Basil the Great's liturgy. John Chrysostom we get for Lazarus Saturday, even though, and Annunciation, even though on Holy Saturday we'll be doing Basil again. I have a theory on those things, but it's very long. Anything else that's striking here? So this is instead of the Trisagion, so instead of Holy God. How many times a year do we replace Holy God at the liturgy? It's really low, the number. It's like 5 times, or 6 maybe. So you have Holy Saturday and Lazarus Saturday, the day of Theophany, the day of Christmas, and I think the eve of Theophany too, if there's liturgy. It's a really rare occurrence. Normally we think about church hymns in 2 categories, fixed and variable. Fixed are the things we sing all the time. So every Sunday we sing Holy God, basically. We don't think of Holy God as a hymn that changes, but there are times appointed in the church where we sing something different. Why do we sing something different?
The day of baptism.
Yeah, we only sing it on days where we baptize people historically that were big baptismal days, where we'd be baptizing dozens or hundreds of people. So it's a great historical marker to kind of look at what days did the early church baptize people on. It's those 4 or 5 are kind of the days, because we know we get instructed to sing this at liturgy. So another kind of thing happening on Lazarus Saturday, apart from all these other things, is that it is one of the days historically where we baptize people. I have a little kind of personal affection for it because my dad was received into the church on that day. And it kind of makes sense. There's 2 schools of thought, like basically you baptize people on Lazarus Saturday, then they can go through all of Holy Week being part of the church, or you baptize people on Holy Saturday so that Pascha could be their first experience in the church. Those 2 kind of ways of receiving people are both valid, both have huge historical antecedents in the church, you know, tons and tons of manuscript history of records of people being received on those days. I will also point out it is one of the really rare occasions where we sing something from St. Paul in the service. Typically, what we're singing is 2 categories. What we call composed hymns, which we just read one by Leo, we just read a Kontakion, we just read one by Theodore. So a hymn that somebody wrote, or it's psalms from the Old Testament. It's even pretty rare that we sing direct quotes from the New Testament besides the Beatitudes, which are sung a lot. So it is kind of one of those weird like liturgical trivia things of It's a direct quote from Paul's Galatians letter, which we actually just heard on Sunday. So what are we doing on Lazarus Saturday? We looked at a lot of texts. Two things I think we're not doing. I'm going to take a very classic Orthodox thing and tell us what we're not doing first. It's not St. Lazarus Day. It's not the day of St. Lazarus. He is a saint in our tradition. There's a strong tradition around him and who he was and what he did. He was resurrected, not just kind of to be a miracle, but to go and be his full self and who he's supposed to be. Tradition in our church holds that he was the first bishop in Cyprus, and he's still commemorated by the Church of Cyprus that way, and I believe their main cathedral is dedicated to him. His feast is in the fall. It's not a historical remembrance in the sense of a secular holiday, or even some church holidays where we're not necessarily remembering a specific day of a specific historical event like we would on Bastille Day or Armistice Day or I don't know what French holidays. July 4th. It's more than that. I think basically we're doing 5 things, and I think I've covered them all. We're being pointed towards the goal, right? So it's kind of the first major shift towards the resurrection narrative. We're being brought into that narrative as participants. We're being told that a specific period of time in our ascetic life is done, Lent. We're baptizing people. And through all of it, in every part of the text, we're proclaiming the underlying truth and message that Christ is risen. It is, at its heart, a very, very resurrectional service. I have a final quote from Father Schmemann as number 7, which I'll read. What is virtually absent from the Lenten experience is that physical and spiritual effort aimed at our participation in the today of Christ's resurrection. Not abstract morality, not moral improvement, not greater control of passions, not personal self-perfecting, but partaking of the ultimate and all-embracing today of Christ. I love that quote because a lot of the hymns during the Lenten cycle, and even some of the ones that we looked at tonight, do have that kind of flavor of moral improvement and self-reflection. And, 6 weeks of it, which is really 8 weeks because there's 2 pretty solid pre-Lenten weeks, it can be kind of heavy and hopefully, encourages us to different behavior. But what I love about Lazarus Saturday personally is it opens up that resurrection message and resurrection narrative to us in a very personal way. And I hope for you, as you attend these services in the next few days, opens up your ears as well. Any questions, thoughts, reflections, things you disagreed with?
Would you write this up in some way and publish it?
I have. It is very long and has over 60 footnotes. It's a pretty dry read. I can try to adapt it to a more to not impressing my liturgics professor, which was the point at the time. Got an A, by the way. Yeah. They always told us in seminary, it's really hard to get an A and it's really hard to get an F. Middle of the pack.
Now, what was the argument that you had with the priest?
Good memory.
Another weird thing that's technically variable in the liturgy, that we don't think it's variable, we think it's the same every week, is the hymn Come Let Us Worship that we sing when the priest does the little entrance and raises the gospel. Come let us worship and fall down before Christ who rose from the dead. That phrase is variable. During the week, the phrase we use, and when it's not a Sunday, the day of resurrection, is who is wonderful in his saints, or through the prayers of the Theotokos, depending on the day of the week and what's exactly you're doing liturgy for. The rubrical books in the OCA have it wrong, and they say you should sing on Lazarus Saturday, come let us worship who is wonderful in his saints, as if it were a normal Saturday. every other instruction for the priest and the choir director for Sunday, for Lazarus Saturday matins and liturgy is just this simple phrase over and over. Do it as you do it on Sunday. So I got in a fight with the choir director because I'm like, or as the choir director filling in and at a parish on Lazarus Saturday, because the priest said, well, the book says you sing who is wonderful in the saints. And I was like, it's patently wrong. This is a feast of the resurrection. And I was a little bit more strong-headed in my 20s, maybe, and didn't realize that these kind of things could impact your paycheck. I just told him we're not singing that. I refuse. And I don't know how it works here, but the choir director usually can't refuse to do what the priest tells you to. Kind of the normal order of things in our church, and that it caused a little bit of a ruckus, probably more than was good or edifying on a day such as Lazarus Saturday. I will say that they have amended the instructions, so they now say it's called the Andrew Boyd Clause. If you ask the good people at St. Ticon's, because I think they were tired of me writing in about it. So it says the instruction is, come let us worship. You sing, come let us worship, who is wonderful in his saints. And there's a parenthetical that says, or in some places, who rose from the dead. So we'll see what we do. John Sokich is directing on Saturday, so I'll see what he does. But it's also, that little argument is kind of part of the tension of the day, because it is absolutely resurrectional, but it's a Saturday, and Saturdays during the Lenten period typically are really, really concentrated on commemorations of the departed. Remember, we have Memorial Saturday liturgies and things like that. But you have these bizarre instructions, like at Matins you sing having beheld the resurrection of Christ, which is you only ever sing on Sunday. And there's other kind of indications that it's absolutely supposed to be as on Sunday because it's a resurrectional day. Plus, like, the choir knows the other one better, like, practically. They're going to flub the line. Not this choir, but others.
Pretty good. A. We'll give you an A.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Father.
Tom Hopko used to love to point out Lazarus is the only guy in history who died twice.
Well, that's a good joke. You got to share that one.
Not a joke.
I just mentioned that another fellow fly fisherman, teacher, seminary person, Father Tom Hopko, pointed out that Lazarus was the only guy in history that had to die twice.
A little bit of what I took is from this really old, it's out of print, but I'm almost positive it's in the parish library. It's called The Liturgical Explanation for the Days of Holy Week by Father Schmemann. It's a little pamphlet he wrote that he sent out to people who were donating to the seminary. So it wasn't even officially published, but it's a whole part in there. And he calls Lazarus Saturday peculiar and paradoxical was, I think, the term he used, but part of it's from here if you want to look for more information. Thank you, everyone.